On the fourth Friday of each month, from February to November, the museum puts on a talk, and you can watch the videos. They're published on YouTube. Subscribe, it's free, and click the bell and you'll be notified when the videos become available. Thank you for watching.
I'd like to introduce Dr. Fiona Moore, who's the Archives Manager of the Melbourne Athenaeum, which is Melbourne's oldest public cultural and collecting institution. It began in 1839 as the Melbourne Mechanics Institute and provided the city with its first library, museum, exhibition space and educational opportunities. Fiona has worked in the museum and gallery sector for more than 25 years, holding positions in collections and exhibition management, registration and project management. She has also worked in academia, teaching into the Master of Arts Curatorship program at the University of Melbourne, as well as sitting on the board of not-for-profit organisations. Today, Fiona will provide an insight into the formation of the Melbourne Athenaeum, with a particular focus on how women engaged with an institution that has historically been viewed as male-dominated. Please welcome Dr. Fiona Moore.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for that introduction, Marilyn. Everyone has made me feel so welcome, so it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to apologise from the outset because I'm actually going to cover about 185 years of history in Victoria in, 45, 50 minutes or so. So it is a bit of a whirlwind journey, I'm afraid, but of course I'm very happy to answer any questions afterwards. So thank you. So, commencing in the earliest stages of the European settlement of Melbourne, the Melbourne Athenaeum was the city's first public, cultural and collecting institution. It provided the budding township with its first subscription lending library, museum, exhibition space and a hall that over time that was remodelled and rebuilt to become a theatre that has hosted significant musical, theatrical and cinematic events. It's my aim today to provide an insight into how the Melbourne Athenaeum was founded and also to consider how women engaged with the institution, which was predominantly founded on patriarchal models. Although the first woman subscriber joined the institution in 1848 and women were the majority of members by the mid-1940s, it was not until 1976 that the first female member was elected to the committee of management, while the first female member of staff was appointed in 1918 and the first president of the Committee of Management in 2004. However, when looking in more detail at how the institution developed, it becomes apparent that women were present and participated in the organisation in various ways. They were active, but their contribution and association has not always been officially documented or recognised. So before I get into the history of the Athenaeum, I'd just like to briefly set out the context in which the institution was formed. So the Melbourne Athenaeum was originally established as the Melbourne Mechanics Institute in 1839. The foundational model for it was to be found in Great Britain, and it was to be found in the Mechanics Institute movement. So that commenced in Scotland, with the inaugural institution opening in Edinburgh in 1821, followed 2 years later by one commencing in Glasgow. The development of the movement has been credited to the work of British physician and educationalist George Birkbeck, who you see on the screen here. And he is today considered the pioneer of adult education. So he established and taught classes at the Anderson Institute in Glasgow to tradesmen, and after relocating from Scotland, went on to form a Mechanics Institute in London in 1823. The movement spread rapidly throughout Great Britain, and by 1850 there were 700 institutes that had been established. The aim of the Mechanics Institution was to provide the working man access to educational classes and offered opportunities for self-improvement through offerings such as libraries, museums and lectures. And the term mechanic referred to tradesmen, artisans, manual workers or machine operatives. So the first institute in Australia was founded in Hobart in 1827, which you can see on the screen here, And that was actually only 6 years after the first Mechanics Institute opened in Edinburgh. This was followed by the creation of a Mechanics Institute in Sydney in 1833, and by the 1870s, institutes had opened throughout metropolitan and regional Australia. At the height of the movement, between 1880 to 1910, it is reported that there were over 1,000 institutes operating in Australia. The movement has left an important legacy in Australia, as it can be viewed as the early precursor of technical and adult education. The provision of library services in the institutions, particularly in regional and remote areas of Australia, also represents one of the first substantial library systems established throughout the country. Furthermore, the construction of Mechanics Institutes in towns throughout Australia has left a rich architectural legacy, with many of these buildings now heritage listed, including the Melbourne Athenaeum building. So the Melbourne Mechanics Institute founding was a remarkable undertaking, given it was only 4 years after the European settlement of Victoria and well before the Port Phillip district separated from New South Wales to become an independent colony. It was also the first Mechanics Institute to be established in Victoria. And as this image shows, the city was in its infancy. Journalist, writer and member of the Institute, Edmund Finn, who wrote under the pseudonym of Gary Owen in his book The Chronicles of Early Melbourne, wrote of Melbourne at this time that it was certainly not a city and could be hardly called a town, nor did it even partake of the characteristics of a village or a hamlet. The development of the Melbourne Mechanics Institute was initially campaigned for and suggested by members of the Melbourne Union Benefit Society, which had also formed in 1839. So this society represented the trades that were constructing the city. They passed a resolution to form a Mechanics Institute, which in their words would enable, and I quote, the promotion of science in this rising colony, particularly amongst the young as well as the operative classes. So the Melbourne Mechanics Institute was formally established on the 12th of November 1839 at a meeting held at the Scots Schoolhouse in Collins Street, which you can see here. Annual membership was set for £1, and by 1840 the Institute was operating out of a rented house at the corner of Queen and Burke Street. And within a year of its opening, the first annual report recorded that they had 129 members. So not too shabby. So the first committee of management, the Institute, was all male and consisted of 8 vice presidents, 6 office bearers, including librarian Thomas Byrne, and 32 general committee members. So I would not have wanted to be chairing those meetings or trying to do the minutes. From the outset, it had support from leading men in government, colonial society and the clergy. Its first patron was Superintendent of the Port Phillip District, Charles Joseph Latrobe, who went on to become Lieutenant Governor of Victoria, of course, and its first president was the Police Magistrate, Captain William Lonsdale. So it pretty much had everyone that was great and good in the district of Port Phillip at the time, really. So in its first year of operation, the committee sought donations from its members and those who held official positions to form the nucleus of a library and a museum. They also arranged a program of public lectures and devised a set of rules and regulations which set out the objectives of the institution as being, and I quote, the diffusion of scientific, literary and other useful knowledge amongst its members and the community generally. Now, the language used in these rules was gender neutral, so women were permitted to become members, but it can be presumed that the founding committee did not expect them to do so. It must be noted that the ability of women to access public institutions such as the Mechanics Institute was a contested issue in the 19th century, where their independence and freedom to move in public spaces was restricted, as their gender associated them with domestic and private settings. The lecture program, which commenced in April 1840, was also open to women attendees, with the founding committee stating, due care will be taken by the committee to reserve accommodation for such ladies as may honour the lecture room with their presence. So, the Bourke Street premises was the temporary home of the Melbourne Mechanics Institute until 1842, when it moved to its newly built premises in Collins Street, where the Melbourne Athenaeum still operates today. So we've been running continuously since 1842 in the same premises at 188 Collins Street. The library, reading room and offices were located on the ground floor, and the upstairs was a hall which became an important community and cultural hub. The land on which the institute was constructed was town land, and following unsuccessful attempts in lobbying the government to grant the institute the land outright, it was eventually purchased at auction in 1840 for £285 under the guidance of the institute's secretary, Reverend Thomas Osborne. And a section of the land purchase was then subdivided to pay for the construction of the building along with a bank loan. So, the Melbourne Mechanics Institute's new building was constructed at a cost of £1,921, and it was reported in the Argus of the day as being the noblest edifice in the province. Unfortunately, the occupation of the new premises was not without its problems, as the Institute had to obtain an ejectment order to remove the builders and their families who had taken up residence in the new building. A special constable also had to be placed in the building to protect it from fire and suppress any disturbance. We also know that the Institute's inventory at this time consisted of 12 chairs, 2 candlesticks, 2 sets of bookshelves, 3 tables, 2 window blinds, 1 pair of snuffers and a tray, as well as the library and museum holdings. And sections of the building were also rented out to raise extra income, with the first tenant being the Melbourne City Corporation, now the City of Melbourne, and they were actually in the building until 1852 when the Melbourne Town Hall was constructed and they moved into their new premises. So this image on the screen here shows how the institution's upstairs hall would have looked. So at the back you can see shelves and cases which would have displayed items from the museum collection. To date, no catalogue for this museum has been located, so the full contents of the collection remain unknown to us. Items that were donated to the museum were recorded in the Institute's annual reports and set out a collection that was broad and very eclectic. It included British, Greek and Roman coins, a model of Sydney Cove, a chemical toxicological chest, samples of fossils and minerals, a vampire bat, wasps' nets, and a lithographic drawing of London as it appeared in 1847. So by 1861, the Institute's annual report noted that the museum had been in abeyance for several years, and a recommendation was made to deposit the collection with the National Museum, which of course was the forerunner to Museums Victoria as we know it today, on the condition that it could be returned to the institution on demand at any time. The Athenaeum archives hold records of the museum's curators until 1878, and there was around about 6 or 7 curators for this museum, so it was quite comprehensive. However, whether the collection was transferred to another institution or institutions remains unknown. So, 6 years after the institution opened its Collins Street premises, the first female member joined. This was Mary Anderson, who was known in the patriarchal convention of the day as Mrs. Colonel Anderson. She was the only female subscriber in a membership of 344. She was the wife of Colonel Joseph Anderson, who was a member of the institution's Committee of Management from 1847 to 1853. Very little is known about Mary Anderson, and what has been found refers to her through her marriage and her children. We know she continued her membership until 1852, when unfortunately subscribers' lists stopped being printed in the annual reports until 1866. So we have quite a gap in our membership records there. By 1850, there were 5 female members, including 2 unmarried women, Miss Ainsley and Miss King. When members' lists were reintroduced in the annual reports in 1866, only 1 woman member is documented, Miss Black, and she did not renew her membership the following year. However, by 1869, female membership did increase with 10 women listed. So, in the 1850s renovations, In the 1850s, renovations were completed on the front of the building, with 2 single-storey wings added to the facade on either side of the entrance, as you can see from this image here. Gas lighting was also installed, greatly improving the reading conditions in the library. This also reduced the institution's running costs, replacing the 60 pounds of candles that were being used every 3 months in the reading room alone. During the 1850s and 1860s, the Institute also cemented its role as the city's central meeting place and arts venue. Details of some of the significant events that took place at this time can be found in the brochure which I brought along, 50 Things About the Ath. And what might be of surprise is that many of these events were led by women or arranged in their honour. So one such event was a public soiree held for philanthropist and humanitarian Caroline Chisholm on the 31st of August 1854, where she gave an account of the social conditions of the diggers after visiting several of Victoria's goldfields. Arriving in Sydney from England in 1838, Chisholm became aware of the hardship and poverty facing new immigrants, particularly women and families, and set about on what was to be her life's work, providing homes, jobs and services for immigrants. She returned to England in the 1840s, but travelled to Australia again in 1854, arriving in Melbourne on the 12th of July. The soiree held at the Melbourne Mechanics Institute was to formally welcome her back to the country and was chaired by the then President of the Athenaeum, the Honourable James Frederick Palmer, MD. And the Argus newspaper reported on the event on the 2nd of September, writing that the Mechanics Institution was crowded both with ladies and gentlemen, and every class of the community had its representative. In 1872, the Institute underwent a major expansion with the construction of a new hall located on the ground floor, designed by architect Alfred Smith, and the library and reading room was relocated to the first floor. The hall was a grand and large space, as this image shows, and could accommodate up to 800 people and 150 in the balcony situated at the south end. The floor of the hall had been securely laid to allow for dancing, and there was a 9-metre refreshment room which catered for many large balls. The hall hosted an eclectic mix of events with flower shows, fetes, auctions, smoke nights, luncheons, musicals, dances, concerts, plays, boxing matches and billiard championships. So over the years, the Athenaeum also became the meeting place for groups such as the Victorian Liederfall, so that was the men's choir, the Melbourne Chess Club, the Philharmonic Society and church congregations from the Baptist Society and the First Church of Christ Scientist. The renovations undertaken in 1872 also included the establishment of a dedicated ladies' reading room, which was separated from the rest of the library by a curtained doorway. The all-male Committee of Management stated in the annual report of that year that the room was well stocked with an excellent selection of magazines and newspapers, particularly suited to their tastes, women's tastes. The committee believed that this convenience requires only to be generally known to ladies visiting town, to be welcomed by them as a most grateful retreat from the heat and dust of the streets. Toilet requisites are also provided. And some of the magazines they are referring to included the Young Ladies' Journal, Vanity Fair and the English Woman's Magazine. So the ladies' reading room was heavily promoted by the institution, with 2,000 flyers circulated and advertisements placed in the newspapers of the day. It proved to be highly popular, for within a year of its opening, female membership rose from 10 to 52. The 1870s also saw a change in the makeup of the female membership, with women not subscribed under a married name or associated with a male member of the institution. There is also evidence that some were economically active, operating hotels and cafes as well as schools. In 1873, the Institute acted on its discussions that had commenced several years earlier to change the name of the organisation to the Melbourne Athenaeum, as it is still known today, or the Ath as we refer to it. This was in recognition that the committee was very aware that the organisation was not a mechanics institute in the true sense anymore, and its membership had changed since its opening. In the 1880s, further renovations in the building were undertaken. The front of the building was demolished and reconstructed with a new facade, as this image shows, and it came to be the three-storey building as it is known today. On the first floor was the library, reading room and cloakrooms, and on the second floor was a small lecture hall, equipped with a stage which could be used for rehearsals and meetings, and this was in addition to the larger existing hall that had been created in 1872. In the 1880s, the Athenaeum's most important female member also joined the institution. I'm referring, of course, to the statue of Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom and crafts, which was constructed and installed in a niche at the top of the building and still graces our building today. Funding of 100 guineas was given to the Athenaeum by Alderman Thomas Mowbray to pay for the statue, and it was created by sculptor Richard Kretschmar. So from the time the Athenaeum's large hall was first constructed, many prominent women graced its stage. One such woman was the operatic soprano Nellie Melba, who first appeared at the Athenaeum on the 25th of August 1884 in a benefit concert. She performed for a second time that year at a farewell concert for one of her singing teachers, where the Argus reported that with her natural qualifications and acquired accomplishment, this young lady is undoubtedly an admirable singer. In 1886, Melba travelled to England and in 1902 returned to Melbourne as the famous Madame Melba, and of course went on to have a world-famous and highly illustrious career. In the late 1890s and the early 20th century, the Athenaeum also hosted lectures by prominent social reformers and suffragettes campaigning for women's rights. One such speaker was Catherine Spence. Scottish-born Spence migrated to Australia in 1839 and was an author and is considered to be Australia's first professional female journalist. She was also a social reformer, advocating for orphaned, impoverished and reformed delinquent children, as well as supporting the foundation of kindergartens and government-funded secondary schools for girls. She's credited with being the first woman to write a novel about Australia entitled Clara Morrison, A Tale of South Australia During the Gold Fever, as well as the first social studies textbook. She believed in a proportional representational election system and is credited with being the country's first female political candidate when she ran for the Federal Convention in 1897 to choose 10 representatives from each colony to constitute the Australasian Federal Convention, which was a key milestone in the Federation of Australia. In the 1890s, she was active in the campaign for women to be given the right to vote and travelled throughout Australia lending her support to this cause, and Spence lectured at the Athenaeum in 1896. Vida Goldstein was one of Victoria's leading suffragettes, fighting for women to receive the vote and to obtain equal rights, including equal pay and the right of women to own property. She founded the pro-suffragist publications Women's Sphere and the Women's Voter, as well as the National Council of Women. She unsuccessfully stood for the Senate in federal parliament 5 times, commencing in 1903. Goldstein addressed a meeting held at the Athenaeum in November of that year, with over 500 people in attendance, to campaign for her nomination. At the meeting she stated, "It is said to be unwomanly to stand for Parliament, but it is not unwomanly for a woman to tout for votes for her husband." Goldstein returned to the Athenaeum in 1909, delivering her speech in her role as an executive of the Women's Political Association. An event was also held in her honour at the Athenaeum in February 1912 to welcome her home to Melbourne after her visit to Great Britain, where she had joined in the fight for women's rights to vote over there. So during the First World War, the Melbourne Athenaeum employed its first female staff member when Miss Alice Cooper was hired as a lady library assistant. She was the successful candidate out of 102 applications and received the role. In a special meeting of the Library Subcommittee held on the 15th of June 1918, it was recorded that 4 women were shortlisted for the position, with the committee unanimous in their decision to support Alice Cooper. Alice Cooper was the daughter of the Institute's acting librarian during World War I, J.B. Cooper, who was an historian and writer. Alice's employment received so much attention that it was reported in the 12th of February 1918 edition of the Herald as seen on the screen here. The article reports on the competency of Miss Cooper, stating that she seems to have an aptitude for this kind of work. She went on to work at the Athenaeum Library for 11 years. So Alice Cooper was very much a trailblazer, as women were not permitted to become qualified librarians until 1926, when the Women's Qualification Act was passed. So by the mid-1950s, women formed the majority of employees at the Athenaeum, with 12 working in the library alone. The longest serving female member of staff was Leela Witchcombe, you can see on the screen here. Leela commenced working at the library in 1954 at 16 years of age, rising to the position of Secretary of the Athenaeum in 1984. So the term secretary in that terms means almost like the CEO, so the most senior position you can get. She was the first woman to assume this position, and she held this role until her retirement in 2004. In the early 1920s, the Athenaeum underwent major renovations when the existing hall was transformed into a theatre, and it secured a theatre licence from the government, which allowed them to stage, and I quote, any interlude, tragedy, opera, comedy, stage play, farce, burletta, melodrama, pantomime, or any stage dancing, tumbling, or feats of horsemanship. Not entirely sure how they would have got the horses in, but the idea to construct a theatre was the brainchild of the theatrical entrepreneur Frank Talbot, who had leased the original hall from 1922. He wanted to recreate, as he called it, the little theatres, so the very intimate theatres that he'd seen in London and New York. So he negotiated a long lease with the Athenaeum Committee of Management and contributed funding towards the new theatre, which officially opened on the 23rd of December 1924 with a performance of Dear Brutus from the Melbourne Repertory Theatre Company. The theatre was designed by leading theatre architect Henry White, who created a 3-level theatre that sat within the walls of the old hall. So women were also employed at the Athenaeum as usherettes, and the image you see on the screen here shows how they would have appeared in the 1930s. From the 1930s onwards, the Athenaeum screened many significant films, including William Shakespeare's Hamlet, directed and starring Sir Laurence Olivier in the lead role of Hamlet. And Olivier travelled to Melbourne to attend the premiere screening of the film at the Athenaeum on the 11th of June 1948. And films were shown at the Athenaeum until 1977, when the main theatre and the smaller hall, now known as Athenaeum 2, was taken over by the Melbourne Theatre Company. The MTC left the theatres in 1986, moving to the Arts Centre, and since then the theatres have been leased out and have seen a cavalcade of local and international actors, performers, musicians, comedians and singers perform at both venues. The Melbourne Athenaeum also has a long history in supporting and cultivating the visual arts. In 1847, it was the venue for the first solo exhibition to be held in the Port Phillip district by a European artist, and that was George Alexander Gilbert, who actually went on to then establish a drawing school at the Institute as well, and anointed himself as Professor of Fine Arts, because you could in those days. And in the early 20th century, artists such as Frederick McCubbin, John Mather, Grace Joel and the Yarra Sculptors Society all exhibited there. However, one of the most important and long-lasting contributions to the Melbourne visual arts scene was the establishment in 1910 of the Athenaeum Art Gallery, which was located in the space now known as Athenaeum 2, so upstairs. Operating for over 60 years, it was for many years the only gallery located in the city, dedicated to displaying contemporary art and supported both emerging and established artists. So these are some of the views of how it would have looked in the 1920s, 1930s. It has been recorded that the gallery came into being through the efforts of Reginald Wilmot, who was the Athenaeum secretary at the time, with advice from members of the Victorian Artists Society. During this period, there was no art gallery situated in the city in which artists could display their works, and Wilmot responded to this need, and the upper hall was renovated by the Institute's honorary architect Sydney Smith, who oversaw the installation of a lantern light in the roof. The lists of artists, art societies and art groups that exhibited there is vast, with women artists and women art societies being much represented. This includes the Melbourne Society of Women Painters and Sculptors, which commenced in 1902 when 8 female graduates of the National Gallery Art School formed a club with the purpose of securing mutual help and sympathy in their work. Also known as Wombalano and the Women's Art Club, they regularly exhibited at the Athenaeum Art Gallery from 1912 to 1965. The society is still in existence today and is the oldest women's art group in Australia. Its membership has included some of the most acclaimed female artists across several art movements, including Clara Southern, Ethel Carrick, Violet Teague, Jessie Trail, Sybil Craig, Ola Conn and Lena Bryans. And this image on the screen is actually an image done by Sybil Craig of one of the openings at the Athenaeum Art Gallery in 1947. And then on the back of the work, she actually did a temporary little sketch identifying many of the people. So it's a fabulous primary source. That's at the State Library, that one. One of the most frequent exhibitors at the Athenaeum Art Gallery was Clarice Beckett, who was also a member of the Society. She was a student of artist and art teacher Max Meldrum, who is considered to be a pivotal figure in the development of Australian art, introducing and promoting tonal effects in painting. Beckett exhibited alongside him and his associates at the gallery, as well as taking part in other group exhibitions. Largely overlooked and her painting style severely criticised and misunderstood during her lifetime, Beckett is now acknowledged as one of Australia's most important modernist painters. Her paintings capture the effects of light and shade, are highly atmospheric and represent familiar Melbourne scenes and landscapes. Throughout her career, the Athenaeum Art Gallery was where Beckett held most of her exhibitions, mounting solo shows annually from 1923 to 1933, and a year after her passing from pneumonia at the very young age of 48, a memorial exhibition of her works was also staged at the Athenaeum Art Gallery. The Athenaeum's annual reports record that the gallery as being highly successful and much favoured by the Melbourne art world. Within only 2 years of opening, it is referred to as having a worldwide reputation. By 1950, the then president of the Athenaeum Committee of Management boldly claimed it to be the largest and best gallery in Melbourne, other than the National Gallery. Unfortunately, the gallery closed in 1971 after interest in the venue waned in the late 1960s, when many new independent commercial art galleries opened in the city and the inner suburbs of Melbourne, providing more display opportunities for artists. So although the Athenaeum has had many strings to its bow, its beating heart has always been the library, and this is how the library appears today. Since its humble beginnings in rented premises in 1840, the library now consists of 37 titles covering books, e-books, audiobooks, DVDs and magazines, and members can still access daily newspapers. It purchases approximately 1,200 books per year, and we have over 1,000 members, some of whom have been subscribers for more than 50 years. The library continues to contribute to the social and cultural life of Melbourne with a robust program of events, including musical performances, authors' talks, lectures, as well as book and screen clubs. It also participates in many of Melbourne's festivals, including Open House Melbourne, the Australian Heritage Festival, the Seniors Festival and Melbourne Rare Book Week, and for the first time this year we'll be presenting an exhibition in the next couple of weeks in celebration of NAIDOC Week. So one of the most important aspects of the history of the Melbourne Athenaeum is its library members, and this is reflected in the institution's first library suggestion book, page of which you see on the screen here, and this spans the period of 1871 to 1893. Held in the Athenaeum's archive, this book provided members with an opportunity to interact with the institution by recommending new books, newspapers and magazines for acquisition. It provides an excellent insight into the reading tastes of the time, covering subjects such as travel, history, art, architecture and theology. As this page from the suggestion book seen here on the screen reveals, members also use the book as a means of providing feedback and helpful hints as to how the library could be better set up for patrons. So you can just see down the bottom there, little description of the doorway and the vent. So you've got a very helpful member who's talking about better ventilation for the library. So then John White, who was also a member at the time, and seems to have been a regular contributor to the suggestion book throughout June 1893, was very free with advice as to how members could be better served. His entries, as seen on the screen here, cover ideas such as, I suggest that a bell be placed on the mantelpiece in the reading room so that the members who sit by the fire may be able to call on one of the assistants in the library when they wish to change their newspapers. Members spend no longer than 15 minutes seated in front of the fire, that a wide guard be placed in front of the fireplace to better distribute the warmth, and that the committee stamp out the objectionable habit of members resting their feet on the chairs. So nothing's really changed. And then the final entry in the book is not by Mr. White, but by another member who's obviously been keeping track of Mr. White's suggestions. And he, and I quote, proposes that John White be medically examined with a view to transmission to Yarra Bend, as he is a menace to the comfort and safety of members of this ancient institution. You can imagine when I was going through this, I was quite, I was laughing out loud by that stage. So in conclusion, the Melbourne Athenaeum is part of the wider history of the Mechanics Institute movement in Australia. It is pivotal in the early development of Melbourne, and its building and activities have evolved over time to meet the needs of its members, both men and women. It also stands as an important institution in which the changing role of women in society can be traced. The evolution of women in public life, their leisurely pursuits and cultural interests, engagement in the workforce, and fight for equal rights can be seen through the lens of the Athenaeum. As you peel away the layers of the institution, its legacy to Melbourne's cultural and social history is immense. And I hope it continues to add to this legacy for many more years to come. Thank you.
I think we've got some time for questions. Has anyone got a question?
Oh, so where it's blank? No. And you know, the really annoying thing is that's where the book finishes. So we never know what happens. So yeah, it's a bit of an unknown. So there's no more contributions after that page.
Ava? What's the connection between the Mechanics Institute of Queenscliffe, in his history, and the Athenaeum in Melbourne?
There were a number, the Mechanics Institute movement swept through Australia, particularly in, right up to the 1900s. So most small towns, regional areas would have had a Mechanics Institute. So although there wouldn't be necessarily a direct link between Queenscliffe and Melbourne, the Athenaeum, they all would have been founded on that same model. And the model was very much about self-improvement and self-education. And these little institutes popped up everywhere. So you know when you're travelling through Australia and you'll come to a very small town and you'll find Mechanics Institute. Now, very few of them actually run like that now. Some are still libraries. I think in Victoria now there's only about 11 left, of which we're one. Ballarat, Paran, and there's Footscray, Berwick, and a few others in regional towns that still operate in terms of having library or museum facilities, and not all of them are open all the time. But it was this whole idea of, and it had swept through Great Britain, and particularly in Victoria after the gold rush, they appeared everywhere because there was this whole idea of there was this sense of chaos and lawlessness and people coming in that weren't educated. So it was this whole idea, instead of going to the pub, they'll go to the Mechanics Institute and they'll learn something.
Just following up on that question,
Was there an association of Athenaeums? Because who actually then developed them in all these different areas?
It was often just the local people. It was this whole idea that it was seen as, and it was very much a transport of that British ideal following, you know, we were part of Great Britain, we were part of the British Empire, so we imported a lot of these whole ideas of education, cultural institutions, and the Mechanics Institute movement was right up there with those. So it was that very much that, oh, well, we're starting a town, we have to have a Mechanics Institute as much as we have to have a local church. Yeah. So often it was people who were, you know, as I would say, the great and good in a town, in a community, and they got together and formed it. And often you might have a few people who actually funded it as well.
I was we were a country family, and the Athenaeum was an important borrowing library for country people. And does that still operate?
Yeah, we still do have some country members. But what I didn't mention here, though, is that the Melbourne Athenaeum from 1922 right up to the 80s or so had a huge big country subscription service. And at its peak, it employed about 5 or 6 staff just to service the country members only. And the books would go on the train each day and come back each night. So that was a very big aspect of their operations.
Could I also ask, why is it that the Athenaeum still exists in the sense that it's a borrowing library? So how is it different to, like, the Melbourne City Library, which is in Queenscliffe?
We're a subscriber library only, so we're actually not government funded. So the Melbourne Athenaeum is an incorporated body, we're a not-for-profit. So we have a voluntary committee of management, and we are not part of the public libraries network at all. So we don't get any government or grant funding.
So do you have a special focus?
We do, so particularly on Australian literature and crime and biography, but particularly strong on Australian literature.
I just want to ask, how do you see its future?
Very good at the moment, actually. So we've got the most members we've had in a very long time. So we were very happy earlier this year we cracked to 1,000 members, which was terrific. Because what we're trying to do is, if you do join, you don't just get your library membership. We are still trying to hark back to what the Mechanics Institute was. So this very much this arts and cultural hub. So as part of your membership, you also get free entry into a lot of all of our musical performances, of which we have sort of once a month, and they go from both contemporary to classical. We do have a lot of lectures and authors' talks and so on, and most of that is free. And we do try and participate in as many festivals as well, so we're getting new people in. But I think at the moment we're all feeling very positive, and we have a fantastic committee of management that are very supportive, and we have staff who absolutely love the institution. So it's a lovely supportive environment in which to work in, and it's a beautiful building, and you feel you're a custodian of this amazing history.
Thanks for that. That was brilliant talk. Just want to ask a bit about the building. Obviously, it's heritage listed. How does it maintain? Because it's very expensive, and it's still owned by the society, I assume. So it's incorporated body. So we do own the building, which is we're lucky about that. We managed to survive, and I think this is the only reason why the Melbourne Athenaeum has survived as long as it has, because when it was initially built, they put in the two shops in the front, so we have rent that comes in from there. We also lease out the theatres, and they've been on a long-term lease, and then we have some money coming in with subscribers. Unfortunately, it's not enough to do big capital works. So, as you said, it's a building dating from 1842, and it needs a lot of work. And probably at the moment, we would say we need a new roof, we need new toilets. It's just continual. And because we've also got the theatres, we've got a lot of facilities that have to be, kept up for that. So, for example, even things like 2 weeks ago, we had to put in 3 new hot water systems in the dressing rooms because they were all leaking. So these are things that happen in a multi-purpose building as well, and in a building that is as old as the Athenaeum.
Can you apply for government grants, or do you have
We're very fortunate. So every end of the financial year, we do have a giving program. So we do have very supportive members, which is fantastic. And yes, we can apply for government grants. And I do quite a lot of that in my area, particularly around caring for the collections and doing digitisation programs and cataloguing exhibitions. So yes, that is most definitely a source of funding for us. But of course, you know, people familiar with grants, they do take a lot of time and you're not necessarily going to be successful. But we're always on the outlook for grants and funding sources, yeah.
Fiona, thank you so much for coming.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
All right, it's been so extensive and so interesting, and I recall as a young girl going to plays at the Athenaeum Theatre, and so as the slides came up,
yeah, and that's the thing, most people do, they all have a memory of the Athenaeum, which is lovely.
Yeah. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.